This is my first part of my Syrian style, meaning factional or sectarian, uh, Second American civil conflict. This is modeled heavily on the Syrian style, or the actual Syrian civil conflict with all its factions and groups. And this is the part one video for my documentary series. There will be four, all done in live formats, combining story and battle map videos for the more interactive portion. This is just a story portion, as I am basically reading a detailed story introducing all the factions, and how things essentially kick off. So there are a few disturbing things in this, so viewer discretion is advised. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start reading. Amid the chaos sweeping the land, once considered the so-called leader of the free world, nefarious forces in a number of increasingly well-armed, secretly organized corps of what would soon mushroom into large factions began to plot and scheme their next moves. Set to the background of a tumultuous series of false flag attacks, economic and financial collapse, rot and decay of the societal structure, and so-called social contract, combined with moral disintegration and more, all, for the most part, ultimately the machinations of the Western shadow globalist elite, secretly ruling the nation's regime since its very inception. However, the goals of this satanic globalist shadow elite were soon to backfire on them in ways their greed and sheer hubris and arrogance couldn't allow them to even foresee. Of course, without a doubt, the elites of the East, such as the CCP of China and Russian political oligarchy, among others, did their part to infiltrate, subvert, and even set up the West for an ultimate foreign invasion in the process, as they too did what they could to get the West to tear itself apart in order that their plans be completed as easy as conceivably possible. But, however, that is another story for another time. More and more, the globalist Western elites sabotage themselves in pursuit of their illusory, far out of reach Great Reset, or Fourth Industrial Revolution. They, in so doing, alienated themselves from much of the world in the process, making many myriads of enemies inside and out of America. Also, it should be duly noted that they ripped to pieces their military and means of power projection, both inside and outside of the USA. Canceling oil and gas production, selling emergency stocks from the strategic reserve, left the regime exceedingly low on fuel. Therefore, food production and transport thereof suffered immensely. This also led to an utter lack of fuel for gas-guzzling military vehicles, as well as civilian vehicles also. Though there was some fuel production left domestically, it was minuscule compared to past times, due to piss-poor management from globalist regime green policies. Another issue leading to the rise of the conflict was the resulting supply chain collapse, unemployment running rampant, as well as food, fuel, and even limited race riots in some areas. However, the latter was cultivated and managed by the CIA and wasn't completely grassroots. In fact, as the riots got really intense in a few major cities, the regime took off its gloves and showed its iron fist and fangs. It dropped all pretenses of being a so-called civil, elected regime, thus showing its true colors as it opened fire on a food stamp riot in Chicago. As one crowd tried to storm local regime buildings demanding their benefits and entitlements, upon the regime not paying them out due to the collapse of the dollar. Local SWAT paramilitary forces and Illinois National Guard were ordered by the globalist mayor and their commanding colonel, respectively, to open fire on the crowd. Thus, as horrified local politicians hid and others ran, hoping to avoid the turmoil and any potential retaliatory behaviors of the crowd, other similar riots happened and grew and lasted for days in many northeastern major cities, as well as some in LA, the Bay Area, and Seattle. By this time, many states had called up their guard forces, and even the DC regime mobilized reserves after a total call-up. This was the moment the Western globalist elites and their puppet regime leaders had been waiting for. It was almost time to attempt to implement their major globalist policies, as it appeared their goals were within reach. Little did they know, or even understand, men make plans and God laughs, as the saying goes. The aforementioned statement couldn't be more true. A course of unforeseen events was set to occur that would plunge the nation into total chaos and pandemonium, worse than the most brutally bloody, ugliest civil wars in all human history. The so-called Ordo ab Chaos they wanted wasn't what they would even find at all, as their plans were a failure before they were even drafted. When put into practice, it was to fail due to lack of fuel, so no abilities for major power projection moves. Then there was the entire personnel issue of having only 2.2 million total military personnel. Many were overseas and thus were stranded there. Only a total of 1.9 million were even at home. Also, only a total of 300,000 paramilitary alphabet gang soup forces were available, including desk workers, paper pushers, along with actual armed personnel. So initially, 2.2 million weren't even in the continental United States. Only 2.2 million grand total regime forces would never be enough to occupy the vastness that was the USA. In sheer landmass, a large, well-armed population, with a whole host of varied terrain, cities, and 4 million miles of roads. In 2020, the regime figured out very quickly that it lacked sufficient forces to occupy the whole land. Upon experimenting with, essentially beta testing, some checkpoints in certain western states during the certain events in that time. Now, low on logistical capabilities, they just had to hope that they could simply scare the large masses into complying to their tyranny with some staged security theater or violent crackdowns. This, however, didn't go as intended. There arose a group of Guard, Reserve, and even several active duty military generals from the Army, Air Force, 2 in the Marines, and 1 admiral in the Navy upon the initial collapse of the dollar, final gasps of a dying economy, and the regime's default on all obligations, including military pay, frozen until further notice. And with the resulting civil unrest, they had already figured out what was going on long before the abrupt and final collapse of the nation. They had formed a secret junta led by Lieutenant General Mathis of the USA Army Reserves, with Major General Charles as his deputy and advisor among the group. The rest of the senior officers were appalled at what was going on in the USA and wanted to return it to constitutional rule as soon as the opportunity presented itself. Meanwhile, in the middle of the nation, in secret, a group of former conservative political activists, disillusioned by what had been happening to America, gathered together for one of their many meetings in Omaha, Nebraska. They came from all walks of life. Many learned of how badly they and their nation, their love of their lives, had been utterly played by a wicked group of evil, greedy, snotty, global elites, and their disillusionment over time grew first into righteous anger, then into rage at the evil, corrupt system ruling the regime via its empty suit puppet leaders. Over time, the group had an inner core of leaders, which met to discuss, plot, and scheme their very own future plans for the nation. Originally, many were political activists of conservatism, which added a club-like atmosphere to the leadership core's meetings. However, as they met more often, booking hotel boardrooms and other public spaces for their private meetings, they began to radicalize. At first, it was a slow process, but as the group learned more and more about globalism and about secret societies and the shadowy Western elites in general, the hatred for them, their plans, and the regime grew and festered. The leadership core of the nationwide group was roughly 150 devoted members with ties to other conservative groups around the country. 3 men stood out, who the rest seemed to fall in line behind and give the most floor time / speaking time to in the meetings. The others jokingly called them the Troika, in quotes, or a trio, triumvirate, or simply the group of 3. Among them, one was an ex-Army colonel, former Green Beret, and at 42 years old, recently retired 4 years ago, who still had a very commanding figure in any room. His physique was that of a Siberian tiger, standing at an even 6 foot tall. He was so ripped that his army dress green uniform he wore to formal events hardly fit, along with ribbons and medals from various campaigns and awards from throughout his army career, decking the uniform. The other of the 3, a member of the conservative intelligentsia, was a mathematics professor from the University of Iowa. Though the physical opposite of Colonel McGregor, being shorter and lankier, he had a piercingly serious demeanor about him, similar to a sort of Kaczynski look, which startled some. His name was Professor Albertson, Others simply called him the professor, in quotes, as a sign of respect. He stood up to any signs of so-called weakness encroaching on the campus he worked at. He once even threatened the dean that he would put him through endless frivolous lawsuits for the rest of his life if he tried to force globalist ideology on him as an infringement of his employment rights. The dean complied as the professor stared him down. The third member of the Troika was the former head of the local news affiliate out of Lincoln, Nebraska. He was also a former member of the Black Conservative Caucus, leaving it as soon as he realized politics was an enclosed, rigged game, a system of globalist control. He received his degree in communications and media from Lincoln's local community college. Needless to say, he stopped working at the local news station due to censorship and scripts handed down via the globalist regime's Project Mockingbird program, the CIA news propaganda program. He was born in America, the son of two Congolese immigrants from the Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa. Formerly known in the past as Zaire, the nation that underwent what quite possibly was the bloodiest civil war ever in the modern era. However, all of that would soon change. Although his parents were African, young Alfred Motufa never had an accent. His parents instilled in him a strong work ethic, and he espoused conservative values as he grew up. However, he fell in love with his new nation, as well as being interested in the nation of his parents. He learned about Mobutu Sese and his ultra-nationalist Zaire. He was fascinated by Mobutu's ultra-nationalist ideals, minus the kleptocratic aspects of his regime. He wanted the same for America, an ultra-nationalist American regime where globalism, secret societies, and their corruption are forever vanquished. He was now paid dues from conservative hardcore groups, including militias and others, to be the chief propagandist, head of and star of N0rthwestern Revolutionary Front Radio, a radio station and show specializing in ultra-nationalist propaganda and PSYOP programs and talk shows designed to radicalize the discontented of America to prepare for the ultimate final showdown against globalism. Needless to say, the group was being watched by the regime, but the regime was counter-surveilled by the National Salvation Revolutionary Front members whenever they got too close to closed meetings, causing them to back off. This due to intercepting calls of National Salvation Revolutionary Front members that stipulated that they were well armed and ready to go all the way, in quotes, if it came down to it. The core of the leadership was big, at 150 core members, and secretly designated roving guards, men who ranged from biker gang members to former Army or Marine combat veterans to ordinary militiamen, some decently well trained. The regime kept its distance rather than risk confrontation. No one wanted to die over petty things. No one wanted a bloodbath. That went for both sides of the issue at hand. Discussions and plans on next moves ranged from ham radio operators patching into each other to contact groups about prior handwritten extensive plans sent via couriers to key alt-right militias, as they each had a ham radio operator per militia. The plans had been dispatched prior to the final currency and economic collapse and ensuing civil turmoil. Those in question were the standby plans for the right time and place, as the Troika seen fit. The National Salvation Revolutionary Front radio had been steadily broadcasting, as well as creating CDs, cassettes, even memory sticks for anticipated internet outages to be used on computers even without internet access. As mentioned, all walks of life from around the land secretly affiliated with the pro-nationalist, now ultra-nationalist club, or rather core of leaders. This included artists of the graphic, painting, and computer graphic variety who worked endlessly on mass-producing anti-globalist, anti-regime, and pro-National Salvation Revolutionary Front messages to reinforce propaganda dissemination efforts. As the collapse revved up and gathered speed, they began to hand out their handiwork in shopping centers and other public venues in cities and towns. They also posted up on walls and overpasses on highways, so very many that they became impossible to miss. Printers made leaflets that served as informational material to wake up the sleeping masses with harsh, undeniable truths about the evil regime and globalism in general, while also steering them to sympathize with or even to join their group. The core leaders all had many connections with similar people, chapters, and other alt-right forces that began to unify with them for their big moment. Some were even military forces of guard and reserve varieties, including some air guardsmen as well. As the riots grew more violent and turbulent, as the regime deployed tanks to machine gun and run over crowds, the time for their action approached. Little did they know, other groups had their own ideas for America, much as the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, which wasn't the only one, with others arising near simultaneously as they did. On a final note, some members within the leadership corps of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front seemed to be getting cold feet, and thus would soon be dealt with, as the Troika demanded, all in, or you're out. And out in the National Salvation Revolutionary Front meant more than out of the core of its leaders. It meant out of this world via end of life. As the party for the American way of life was coming to a violent end, the Troika vowed to make a God out of blood and rebuild America from the ground up, as went their slogan. They intended to rid the USA of all globalism, secret societies, and elites, and all its bogus, fake political systems and parasites and anything else deemed un-American by the Troika. The Colonel was personally busy with his part of the plan, activating his phone chain of sympathetic former friends and military contacts. It was time for preliminary organization. First call, speaking in code, was to the colonels and adjutant lieutenant colonels and majors of the Guard units, many now activated by governors and federalized by the globalist regime, to join their forces for the big takeover in the works. He dialed first the lieutenant colonel over at 1st Squadron of the 134th Cavalry Regiment, an old friend. This mech infantry force with strikers and MRAPs, but also tanks, self-propelled guns, and infantry fighting vehicles, would be quite handy in seizing Lincoln to establish the National Salvation Revolutionary Front's new capital. He rang friends and contacts throughout the night as he sat in his huge living room in his country estate outside of Lincoln, Nebraska. As of yet, no civil unrest there, but what would come would be more serious. Along with some rogue commanders, there would be alt-right militias and some biker gangs, even a hefty number of combat veterans, not so different from himself. Also, his mathematics professor deputy was about to help release about 10,000 Kaczynskis into the mix, with some calls of his own to friends on the borderline of the lunatic fringe, computer geeks, hackers, and crazy fringe anarchists who reveled in the idea of striking down the great beast of globalism and the entities embodying it. Of course, Alfred Motufu was busy himself, broadcasting angry tirades vowing reprisals for the ultimate betrayal of the nation and the need to cleanse it of globalism, vowing blood to run in the gutters and whip up a frenzy. He did indeed. His small propaganda empire was busy delivering PSYOP products that matched or surpassed any the regime and its CIA could ever produce itself. Underground propaganda networks did his bidding, handing out recordings and leaflets, informing the public to tune in to the man who, with his communication and media degree and his basic understanding of PSYOP methods via his run-ins with the CIA Mockingbird program at his former job, flipped it all back on them. Fires were lit. Damn people trying to call while I'm reading. Fires were lit under the asses of the complacent masses throughout the USA as his material spread and the regime, busy and beginning to become overwhelmed by cascading riots in multiple major cities, could do very little to stop the National Salvation Revolutionary Front propaganda from making its rounds. However, as the security forces of the regime mobilized nationwide, they planned to pay his radio station in a Lincoln suburban home a visit with Army stack teams. However, the plan would fail miserably, as certain Guard units, among others, were about to switch sides. Soldiers follow their commander's orders. The colonel of the Troika already convinced several key local commanders of the National Guard in Lincoln to follow him to the gates of hell and beyond. The National Salvation Revolutionary Front plans began to materialize. The time to strike would be close enough at hand. On July 1st, It was 48 hours away, all being well coordinated, as allies and soon-to-be defectors alike gathered in Lincoln and other key cities in the Midwest, and even some areas of the Southeast as well. The secret curried plans were battle plans for the day of the revolution. Each group or affiliated element would play a key role. Even retired and some still active special operations forces would play a role. All contacts of the colonel himself. It was now June 29th, and the regime was cracking down and trying to complete the mobilization for the full violation of posse comitatus, although still lacking enough personnel for a full martial law. Also, the fuel, food, money, and logistics necessary. The arrogant globalists, however, believed that one good crackdown somewhere, anywhere, would be enough to scare the masses into compliance. It was too late for that, as there was a day of rage coming like none other. Elsewhere, in Salt Lake City, Utah, Church President Nelson was facing a crisis of leadership. The nation was imploding, and the governor of Utah came to him for orders on what to do. A Mormon himself, he obeyed the church president, always before the American president. Utah was quiet, well behaved. However, discontent had been brewing due to economic and financial decay in the nation. Moral decay was a huge factor as well. The governor asked if the Utah Guard should be mobilized to keep order. Nelson was at an impasse. He wondered where his true loyalties lay, as he was a member of FEMA's clergy response team, essentially a regime spy, a mole within his church organization. He told the governor to return in 24 hours, as the governor informed him that time was a factor, as he issued a 48-hour standby order to mobilize the Guard for regime federalization. Nelson had a literal and figurative headache and a crisis of conscience. However, drastic changes would soon occur that Nelson would no longer have a part in, as he would be gone and out of the picture. Meanwhile, on June 29th, on an FLDS compound, 20 miles away in the mountains outside of Salt Lake City to the north, gathered a group of ultra-zealots, extremists who went by the name the Supreme Council of Elders, a name they bestowed upon themselves. They all sat, Indian style, on small prayer rugs in old Western attire, tunic-like shirts with sashes, some adorned with vestments upon their shoulders. Led by Supreme Acolyte Josiah, they sat and prayed together before one of Josiah's 10 wives, Anna, brought them some freshly squeezed milk from the compound's small dairy farm, where the women labored all day. She also bestowed them with an herbal tea, followed by strict Orthodox Mormon dietary standards. Josiah thanked her before grabbing her by the dog collar that she wore, as it was worn by all the women on the compound, as a reminder of their subservient place among the men. He stared at her momentarily before telling her to finish the chores and the dishes and wait for him in bed with the other wives once they've all finished their chores too. The other acolytes chuckled over it as Josiah released her and smacked her ass hard as she turned to walk away. He then said, "Soon we will teach all women their place among men. They all will stop being whores and learn to marry and devote themselves to one man, as we will many women. And thus we will create strong Mormon families." There was an amen uttered in agreement at Josiah's bold statement. Shortly thereafter, the men all began in earnest to discuss the moral decay and the absolute need to save the Mormon way and spread it all across the nation and world, were it possible. They all began to discuss their recent works of spreading their edicts all around the world via cassette tapes, as well as building homemade munitions and accruing small arms for the coming takeover of the Mormon Church from Nelson, whom they all agreed was a shill, a false Mormon, and not serious about his faith, and moreover, a traitor to God, the Book of Mormon, and Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. Upon that statement being made, another acolyte jumped up and yelled, "Hallelujah, I feel the spirit of Brigham Young all over us." Then the others joined in, as the energy in the room became charged and radical. Another acolyte addressed the room and said, his newly formed Brigham Young Brigade was completing their training. For those who weren't even aware to this point, insofar as the activities of the Council of Elders was concerned, they united with other radical Mormon compounds and sects, believing the end-time prophecies of Joseph Smith were about to come to pass. They began to raise up and train a small militant, radical Mormon extremist group, armed and ready to seize control of the church and guide it to its destiny of rulership and dominion over first America, then the world. The Brigham Young Brigade was a radical Mormon religious extremist militia trained by former combat veterans of former overseas wars. They were Mormon church veterans who radicalized due to unemployment, found salvation in compound life. Their skills and experience helped train the Mormon militants in battle tactics of the small unit basic varieties, as well as primitive munition making and munition handling abilities. After the acolyte finished speaking the good news on that, Josiah raised his arms in the air as if to give thanks to God, though his ideas about God differed drastically compared to most. His God was different than the Christian God. Josiah was a certified religious kook, a cult leader, though a very extremely charismatic one the other acolytes would be willing to die for, to become martyrs. Soon, Josiah's edicts would be on radios all over Utah, even throughout the USA. Although his faction would be primarily in the Southwest, even so, his religious programs and even terrorist-style attacks would reach out and touch many soon enough. Infidels would be beheaded in their thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. He and his acolytes of the Supreme Council of Elders made their plans for the next 48 to 72 hours to seize all of Utah by capturing the temple and Capitol building in Salt Lake City. Upon closure of the meeting, once the acolytes all have spoken, they all closed with a, "May your will be done, Supreme Acolyte Josiah." By June 30th, the governor was due back to visit Church President Nelson to discuss the Utah Guard mobilization. Little did both men know, things would end in fatal disaster for each, as the beginnings of the Mormon State, one of the most brutal factions in the uprising, the Second American Civil Conflict. They would be hijacking Utah and additional areas of the Southwest. Lieutenant General Mathis, Chief of the United States Army Reserve, the entire reserve component commander in his headquarters in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, met with the other conspirators in his office, regardless of the no smoking policy inside post buildings. He chewed on his cigar as he spoke to the other generals and one admiral. Gentlemen, we've discussed this for months now. We've tried to war game how we would go about it. Nothing about this is going to be easy. And because the best laid plans often go to waste, we need a solid backup, which we've also war gamed. Admiral, I know with the inflation, lack of spare parts, and even layoffs at Norfolk, as well as about 70% of our nation's fleet moored away in port due to fuel, maintenance, and logistical issues, do you at least still have that one ship at our disposal for this plan? If so, can you and the Navy still play a key role in saving this nation before it's totally gone? Yes, General. We still have the USS Lassen in working order. Its captain and crew are solid and on board. All in working order. They just rearmed last night with 96 Tomahawks, all in prime working condition. Captain Teagan gave me assurances. I'll initiate on my orders whenever you're ready. Excellent. Everyone else know the mission? My reserve sub-commanders all know about the coup. We don't need to worry about the enlisted. They'll obey their orders regardless, especially when they're briefed and told the horrible truth about the Great Reset and the government's plans for this nation. They'll finally understand what the international globalist slogan, "Build Back Better," even really means, as well as what it means for they and their families' futures. They then went over the coup plans repeatedly, as they had their primary and secondary plans. It was the 29th of June, and Lieutenant General Mathis still had to pretend he was still loyal to the globalist regime in D.C., which planned crackdowns across the United States and the major cities within the next 48 hours. And Mathis, being head of all reserve forces, was ordered to put them all on standby for 48 hours deployment into major U.S. cities to aid guard units already in some of them, cracking down with alphabet gang paramilitary forces. The regime was desperately low on personnel, even for the tasks at hand. It was about to get worse, as the laws of cause and effect took their toll. In these several large cities, rioters already fought back hard, now with small arms, and some deadly Molotov attacks on regime vehicles and associated forces. The regime needed more forces mobilized and fast, and all they were even dealing with was angry, violent mobs. They haven't even met the soon-to-arise factions as of yet. Soon, however, they'd all make their debut. The regime CIA radical elements pulled yet more false flags, thinking that it would scare people or at least distract them into a more compliant attitude. But by the 30th of June, It was plain to see that the regime was low on resources and logistics, including food and fuel, and low on money, and unable to pay troops or welfare or other obligations, and thus defaulted and had to put a freeze on all regime employee pay, and also veterans' benefits, which infuriated many veterans, driving them into the factions, beginning to barely reveal themselves. Other small factions began to crop up elsewhere, also having had been lurking in the shadows before the Great American Collapse. There by this time had already been some loosely affiliated militias in the state of Maine. Many left groups like the 3%ers to make their own local groups. In southern Maine, towns secretly band together where the men, mostly veterans, but other armed men and some women, trained together to protect their communities. Some were even part of the Maine National Guard, a small force, as it were, mostly aviation units with poorly maintained helos that didn't fly as often lately. However, they did have some mortars, anti-tank weapons, and some armored personnel carriers, though not all were in working order due to the lack of parts. However, soon they'd merge and desert the Guard to become one with the Maine militia to keep the increasingly evil rogue globalist regime out of Maine. They'd see action soon enough. Robert Montillier, their leading commander, obtained his position as their commander via a clandestine vote having had been taken. An author and historian, he mostly studied and wrote books on war history. 2 were bestsellers in the World War II history genre. He was partly picked for his extensive knowledge on war strategy for the obvious reasons. In the Southeast, yet another similar, albeit larger force had been forming. It was the result of a large collection of pro-Southern-oriented militias who were utterly disgusted by the direction that the nation had been thrust into. Massive Southern unemployment and the disenfranchisement and disillusionment with current conditions in the nation led to a general reignition of pro-Southern secessionist sentiments, returning to large parts of the population there, especially in Georgia, coastal South Carolina, and small southern coastal areas of North Carolina, an area highly dependent upon tourism for its local economic survival. The ensuing economic disasters and the ultra-high inflation led to many southern-based militias in these areas coming together into a fairly decent-sized amalgamation of armed men, seeking to do what once had been considered as the unthinkable in terms of breaking with the rest of the USA. Events in Texas, and especially in neighboring Florida, would dictate their overarching goals and objectives, namely, a union with Florida and also an alliance with Texas. The core of their moderately sized forces were, of course, hardcore militias, many with their own compounds and training centers in the woods. They were led by a retired major from the Marine Corps. As conditions rapidly deteriorated, Major Thomas Jolson would appeal to other Marines in current service to the regime, some at the Citadel, a Marine Corps officer training installation. In fact, the first significant action of the forces of the newly formed Army of the Southeast was to lay siege to the citadel, where for his part, Major Jolson sent a representative into the citadel, offering quarter to them if they'd surrender or perhaps consider even switching sides. The demands and terms were even a veiled way of disseminating the group's propaganda. This, as it articulated clearly all that was going on and why their own future depended upon their course of action moving forward, and to be on the right side of history, in quotes, and to remember your sacred oaths, in quotes, mixed in with anti-globalist regime information and where the regime was taking things, including appeals to think about their families and their future in a totalitarian state, with info about democide, which is death by regime, and past totalitarian regimes, all well articulated in nearly an essay type of format, yet easily understood. Furthermore, it ended by saying, "Are you sure you want to fall for a totalitarian regime that'll throw you and those you love away once they've used you up and you've served your purpose to them?" Upon the message and terms being exchanged in an act of rare goodwill by the regime by this stage of events, the envoy was permitted to return to Jolson, who himself was personally present and commanding the operation himself on the ground. He was informed that serious contemplation of the terms would be required. At least 24 hours to consider by the Citadel's commander and command structure, who for their part were already having some misgivings about the regime to begin with, being that the Citadel was a military academy that trained mostly cadets for commissions into the Marine Corps, as well as liaisoning with the DoD itself due to actual military, both naval and Marines, enlisted personnel being present and part of the structure of the military training regime, similar to West Point. There were stores of some basic gear and equipment there on site, and the cadets themselves would make quasi-professional, or at least decent small unit advisors, or even leaders, or just plain manpower additions. It was Jolson's hope that they, and the small number of military men there, would switch sides. The cadets weren't stupid, for they themselves weren't fully insulated from the goings-on in the nation. The other retired officer, who was the head of the Citadel's academic program and nominally of the entire academy, had to discuss matters with the actual current military personnel also present there, who themselves were split on that course of action they should take. But being besieged, outnumbered, and with limited options for themselves, chose to do the honorable thing and turn their backs on the increasingly evil, now out in the open, globalist regime. They already knew what the score was, as they'd been privy to all the mobilization orders coming down to enforce unconstitutional regime police state policies right here at home. All things considered, in the current climate, and being essentially surrounded and cut off on three sides by land and their backs to the sea, they caved. Meanwhile, in Charleston, other local Army of the Southeast elements from around the city's outskirts seized control in the still relatively calm South Carolina city. Quickly, they established roadblocks, set up sharpshooters on tall buildings to pin down any potential trouble spots. Local PD was helpless to do anything, as technicals, essentially pickup trucks full of armed men, essentially raced into all corners of the city to seize control in a very rapid, high-tempo manner. In most cases, local PD stood down. Some decided to join, whereas some of the bootlicker types did not, which led to small-scale altercations, which ended quickly, with no mercy shown to regime sycophants. Phone calls authorized by Major Jolson were made to other areas where his forces had gathered. "Citadel is ours," was all he said, which was a signal to his forces in other areas that his first major operation, the make or break it, to determine how far they would go, went off without a hitch. Jolson himself was a former officer and a strategic thinker. For months, even as fuel was beginning to be rationed, he directed his militias across Georgia, South Carolina, and the southern tip of North Carolina to start acquiring all the fuel they could, as often as they could, right down to the last members. Obediently, they obliged him and did as ordered. Some with food stockpiling and ammo, all stashed away, pre-positioned outside of cities they planned to move on quickly and seize as fast as possible. His logistical planning had worked out well, at least in the case of Charleston, South Carolina. Now, he gained another 3,500 personnel to his forces of an initial 20,000 men, which soon would swell to 500,000 as soon as word spread of the fall of Charleston and the citadel with it, as well as soon to be joined by several other medium cities, with more to follow as time raced by. However, Jolson understood in warfare, time and timing was everything. He had hold on a second. He had coincided all these events thus far with all the major rioting in some of the largest American cities, wherein the regime's overstretched and limited domestic forces were having their hands full, quite full, with riots that became savage street battles, which were being brutally suppressed, as the regime dropped all pretenses of being a civilized and savagely showed its teeth for all to see. Jolson knew full well that nearby Marines from Paris Island, further to the south, some approximately 1,200 of them, might be used against him, as his messages of success were being transmitted via the still working phone services, through still active phone carriers, but only for a short time before the regime would order phones to be cut off, in a vain attempt to cut off communications. But it was already far too late, as many factions across the land had gotten their messages out, and the very beginnings of a conflict resembling that of what occurred in Syria in the most horrifying ways was already underway. When the Army of the Southeast made its first moves, it was July the 1st. At about that time that the Army of the Southeast made its moves, events within the two states of Florida and Texas had already been steadily shifting towards practically openly threatening moves towards secession. In Texas, this was especially true, as the rift among its population and the globalist policies and police state attitude of the central regime had already become as undeniable as a gaping wound on a person's body. The state regime, already having to walk a fine line of appeasing their state's fairly large population and its more traditionalist, rural ways and views, as well as keeping the central regime off their back to just be able to breathe, was facing tough choices. The state regime was already split in a measure of thirds. 2/3 wanted to cut their losses and leave the regime. The other 1/3 was vehemently pro-regime and its globalist policies. However, there came soon a day of decision and a day of reckoning, as riots over food, fuel, and even inflation, and civil rights and secessionist goals hit all the major and even medium cities in Texas. The state regime, already having called up its entire guard forces, mostly the huge 36th Infantry Division, with all of its subordinate brigades, among other units, was on the verge of deploying them for riot control, even with heavy weapons, something that horrified most within the state regime itself. The current spineless governor would soon be relieved of his duties and tried for treason by other elements of the state regime whose loyalties were unquestioningly to the state before the rogue central regime. They had all the popular support they'd ever need, and Texas had accumulated a large gold stockpile for such times as these, begun years earlier by those with the foresight to see what was coming down the road as the debt can got kicked further and further down the road. Some of the final straws for the state and its people were the insane green energy policies that demanded and commanded Texas literally to commit economic suicide via the shutdown of its large oil and gas industries. Also, the central regime demanded the state's entire gold depository, in excess of over $1 billion in gold, as well as other precious metals, in terms of pre-hyperinflationary value, which was one of the many spontaneous riots beginning to occur across the land, and leading to official currency collapse and regime default on obligations, thus leading to worse riots over no more welfare and other types of benefits payouts, along with the regime opting to use deadly force to crush these uprisings in some of the larger cities. By the 30th of June, many armed Texas militias began to gather and openly challenge the regime paramilitary alphabet thugs in all major Texas cities, which soon erupted into open street battles. An emergency session of pro-secessionist state leaders was held, who brought their personal firearms both for self-protection, but also to institute a coup on the state level, forcing the resignation of the then governor on the early morning of the 1st of July, but not before having him order the Texas military forces placed under their control in writing, and then naming a new governor interim as a successor in the office of President of the Republic of Texas, in quotes, or the Texas Secessionist Republic. Broadcasts were made from local TV, radio, and even Amber Alert phone broadcasting to override the phone shutdowns as soon as those occurred. It was an instant messaging platform owned and operated by the regimes of both state and national level. Instantly, riots turned to celebration and joy and elation as news media exclaimed that the Texas military forces and DPS were to expel all regime elements from Texas, and thus were ordered to use force on or capture those who resisted. The new Texas president also put out a broadcast calling upon all able-bodied Texas men to take up their private arms in order to safeguard the future of the fledgling new republic. By the time this last message went out on TV, radio, phone, and word of mouth, the regime by then cut off the phone and net, at least by that point, immediately thereafter. Not merely due to losing Texas, but due to riots intensifying in general, and all sorts of other factions, some even very radical, all making power plays near simultaneously. By late evening on the 2nd, Fort Hood had been fully surrounded by 36th ID of the Texas Guard, local Texas militias, and even some smaller former units from Fort Hood who switched sides upon hearing the news about Texas, coupled with bad news on the pay situation and dollar collapse and regime default. They brought their heavy weapons and ammo intended to be used on civilians with them. 3rd ACR and the 89th MP Brigade took new loyalty oaths to the Republic of Texas before helping to besiege their former home. In the far west, there was better news. All of Fort Bliss joined Texas and decided it was a better course of action. The post commander, a Texan himself, didn't like where the regime was taking things and didn't want to be used by an evil despotic element to fire on his own people. Air installations within the newly created nation chose to do similar. Fort Sam Houston knew they'd never stand a chance alone and defected with its huge army hospital. Only Fort Hood tried to hold out, with its remaining sizable forces, now utterly cut off from the rest of the rogue regime. An island in a large sea of now vengeful enemies of the globalist NWO police state. All wasn't smooth sailing for Texas, however. Even though they appeared to be off to a strong head start, and having their own power grid and access to the sea helped as well, in terms of trading with its main ally, Florida, also in the same boat, essentially, as they were. They'd find another ally in the Army of the Southeast as well, who was very pro-union with Florida to create a larger southeastern coastal state, apart from the regime. However, other factions would complicate those plans, although the failed coup of the junta of Free American Army generals did create the confusion necessary for, and buy the time for, Texas, Florida, and the Army of the Southeast to achieve what they had already, among all the other factions, too, as civil unrest in many areas destabilized things insofar as conditions in the nation for all the factions to emerge in the first place. Texas President Martinez was grateful to some degree for the level of confusion and pandemonium nationwide, as his dream of a free Texas nation finally came true. Although it was true, he was only the interim leader until elections could happen. He planned to be the best temporary leader he could be for his people and his new nation. Only one day later, Florida would declare its full independence from the regime and set up diplomatic and military ties and cooperation with Texas in a full alliance involving trade and commerce and strategic coordination as well in the war. In the case of Florida, though, similar to Texas and its journey towards independence, it already had largely rebelled on its own without even a coup being necessary. In its so-called halls of power, there had already been a growing understanding that the globalist regime would turn on them, fully betraying them by casting them out of their positions and their wealth and prestige gone with it, only to use them as part of an elaborate scapegoat scheme to draw the ire of the people that they would have once claimed to represent had that in fact been allowed to transpire. However, old loyalties to the globalist regime began to die off, suffocated beneath the withering economic and financial conditions happening across the land, including within Florida State itself, thus leading up closer to the final collapse of the currency and economy. Came a moment of clarity wherein the state officials had held clandestine meetings away from the prying eyes of the regime to begin to contemplate, to begin to contemplate how to deal with the emerging threats to they and their well-beings collectively, as well as finding their humanity that had disappeared upon them becoming virtual sellouts to the prior globalist agenda, only to begin to slowly return when it became fully understood and realized that they wouldn't be having a seat at the proverbial table of the big power players. In so doing, also understanding that they needed to take the opportunity to do all they could to rectify their sins, so as to be on the right side of history, by an atonement of at least making a sincere effort at making amends with the people, the common people. Therefore, when the 48-hour mobilization orders went out to the Florida Guard, whose ultimate aim was for federalization, along with the reserves, the Florida State regime prepared to refuse its guard in an act of rebellion against the globalist regime, and instead beat it to the punch by using it against the regime's security forces. Although informing local reserves that they had two choices: join the Free Republic of Florida in its secession, or be thereby deemed as illegal occupation forces of an illegal occupying power, and thus be engaged and destroyed or captured. It was the 1st of July, when riots in Miami and Jacksonville had since been underway over the collapse of the currency and benefits system, among a whole slew of other reasons, for at least a full 2 days by that point in just those cities. The governor and his aides had since prepared a speech for the secession. Despite being prepared and the entire Florida State regime on board, the Florida governor anxiously watched events unfolding in Texas across the Gulf of Mexico. They'd made their move, and just before the phones and net and TV went down, the signed orders of the governor to the state security forces had already gone out earlier in the day. He was now committed. As he prepared for his big speech to be televised on the morning of the 2nd, they found out that radio delivery would be the only option when other means of broadcast went down. Well, radio and the phones, Amber Alert systems. As recordings of the independence speech were played over local radio, reaching most of the state, the rousing speech told truths about the globalist agenda and its false flags and its plans for the average people of Florida and average people in general, and many more items that most ordinary folks weren't prepared to hear, all stirring them into a rage. Not rage against their own people or their now de facto independent state, but rage at an evil regime seated over 1,000 miles north of them. Amid the chaos of the riots that already had been occurring in two of Florida's biggest metropolitan areas, the broadcast and subsequent guard deployment to intercept local reserves to give them their choices and ultimatum. This was aided by pro-regime forces being largely pinned down in those areas, and some installations, due to insufficient fuel for large unit movements, now lacking the guard and also local reserves as reinforcements against the rioters as well. And by the time of the governor's broadcast and a call to arms to expel the globalist occupation forces, as he called them, the rioters, for their part, did just that. And merely a few hours after the independence speech, armed rioters joined those already rioting, causing the riots to morph into grotesque scenes of urban warfare, reminiscent of some of the worst in any third world war zone known to man in modern times. Soon also, all state and some mobilized reserves joining Florida forces would assault regime security force installations across the former state now turned nation. In rural areas, militias began to form up, both known and unknown, previously. At Tyndall Air Force Base, the 325th Fighter Wing, operating F-22A Raptor fighters as a training wing primarily, received their orders from the governor: prepare for possible ground attack and combat air patrol missions. The same also now went for the Air Force Reserve at Homestead Air Force Reserve Base, with its 482nd Air Wing operating F-16 fighters. The Guard forces of Camp Blanding had already been deployed around the state, but already elements of it found themselves in battle with pro-regime paramilitary forces, with an amalgamation of Marines from Blount Island, who in fact were a few companies of logistical troops called out to assist the alphabet paramilitary troops putting down the riots in Jacksonville. Also among them were some Air Force, Navy, and even some Coast Guard personnel, all from bases in the immediate vicinity. The 124th Infantry Regiment came in their Strikers, armored vehicles, from Camp Blanding, albeit with limited fuel and ammo due to massive logistical constraints. They hoped it would be a simple operation to secure the largest urban area of the newly minted nation of Florida. The main objective was to capture the key military logistical center that was Blount Island. It wasn't so much that other logistics weren't available at Camp Blanding, it was that they just weren't enough when it came to trying to secure all of Florida from pro-regime forces. The resources available at Blount Island would aid a decently sized quantity of MREs, would add a decently sized quantity of MREs, bottled water, 150 tons of 5.56 NATO ammunition, 100 tons of 7.62 NATO ammunition, and 50 tons of 50 cal ammo, as well as 50 tons of 9mm pistol ammo. Blount Island was a logistical hub and distribution center for the Marine Corps. Also present there, 10 fuel tanker trucks filled with JP-8, necessary for all military vehicles, mostly on the ground, as well as helos. Reports also stipulated that a stock of TOW missiles were there, with 155mm howitzer shells, fuses, powders, and primers for artillery batteries, albeit in an unknown current quantity. Before the collapse occurred, the regime did pass an executive order that combined all the alphabet paramilitary forces into one single solitary force, now called the National Security Forces, who in total numbered some 300,000. Some 20,000 were currently in Jacksonville, Florida, originally on anti-riot suppression duties, but now were fully engaged in combat with hostile citizens throughout the city. The amalgamation of the local forces aiding the paramilitary numbered some 8,000 total military forces. None but the Marines were trained in urban combat, even though they were merely rear echelon logistical troops. As the strikers approached, of the Guards, 124th Infantry Regiment broke into its 4 battalions, with its 5th, the headquarters battalion, back at the installation of Camp Blanding to command the operation. The 2,000 troops headed into hell, urban combat in Jacksonville. They rolled northeast on I-95, informed that they would receive air support from only a pair of F-22s that were fully maintained and combat loaded for ground attack operations. With satellites still technically linking the Florida Guard on the Blue Force Tracker's most up-to-date, newest iteration, the Air Guard and ground troops of the Guard could see where their enemies were, minus the paramilitary forces. Speaking only of the military. The strikers had an assortment of crew serve weapons and some tow missiles. It was a light mechanized infantry force overall, with no artillery, just armor personnel carriers with the aforementioned. However, the Striker was a nimble vehicle and much better protected than the M1l1tias, which were older armor personnel carriers. The Naval Air Station was unable to field any air support in the chaos for the regime forces, as its mechanics, its ordnance specialists, its technicians, and others were forced to aid in suppressing riots which turned into battle in the city. 45 minutes after leaving Blanding, 2 battalions were sent to seize Blount Island from the regime, the grand prize, and the 2 others sent in to make a corridor to help trapped Florida civilian combatants and refugees to escape, as the pro-regime paramilitary and mixed military elements were too big to handle alone, as merely 1,000 troops couldn't take on 28,000. However, the crew serves and tow missiles were at least enough to keep the lighter armed regime forces at bay for at least a little while. The mission was only to last about 8 hours, to give refugees and Florida civilian combatants currently in guerrilla warfare ample time to flee or retreat to safety. Then, those 2 battalions were to link up with the forces. Sorry, everybody, the phone died. Anyway, I'm back. Okay, can you all hear me? Can you all hear me? Somebody say something. Somebody. Hello? My phone died, everybody. Can anybody hear me? Hello? Okay, good. Yeah, I'm here. All right. Anyway, continuing where it died, the mission was only to last about 8 hours to give refugees and Florida civilian combatants ample time to flee or retreat to safety. Then those two battalions were to link up with the forces that hopefully have by then taken Blount Island with its sizable logistical haul. Doing so would aid in future defensive operations against the regime. In other parts of Florida, events were moving relatively smooth as Florida forces, including local militias coming out of the woodwork, began to establish their control across the state. Even former regime installations, minus in Jacksonville and a sliver of coast just to the south, in the Daytona Beach area. The troops of the Space Force, essentially glorified satellite technicians, engineers, and specialists, as well as computer operators, all surrendered to Florida forces without a fight, opting instead to go quietly into captivity. About the time that the official currency collapse, and thus national collapse, occurred, amid all the rioting in some major and certain medium cities, and even false flag shootings and high-profile assassinations and mystery blasts of random explosives throughout the land, gatherings of militias from across Arizona and Nevada had taken place. Evidently, in the looting and pandemonium that gripped Las Vegas and Phoenix, regime forces around both cities had splintered from one another and began to engage in savage combat, not only with armed looters and other civilian combatants, but with each other as well. Apparently, about the time the net, telecom, and TV went down, a junta of generals had launched a failed coup against the regime. This prompted militia leader Todd Ellison to order his best friend Ryan Builder to use his ham radio to order a general emergency mobilization of all the militias hearing the frequency across the Southwest. Militias who all had already been in radio contact for years. Finally came the time to act, Todd thought. This was it, the chance to make a free, independent Southwest, based on local governance and with armed militias as the core of this confederation of Southwestern communities. Todd, Ryan, and the rest of his local militia's leadership stayed full-time on their private compound. His militia was the size of roughly a brigade. Men from the surrounding areas outside of Reno. They didn't have much, just cans and crates of ammo, all donated by the members, along with fuel and bottles for Molotovs. Many leaders answered the call, both literally on their ham radios, but also in terms of joining Todd and his men. The plan was simple. Let these idiots duke it out over Vegas and Phoenix, while forces gathered elsewhere and took smaller areas that were much less well defended by regime forces or their splinter elements who now called themselves the Free American Army, its own faction. Todd viewed his overall strategy as not being unlike what Mao Zedong in China did, with his rural-based so-called Long March where he gathered strength as he swept through rural China, obtaining support from local farmers and agrarian communities for food and manpower. Todd knew he was in a harsh desert environment, but he planned to make do with what he had. Within 24 hours, forces from various militias from within 50 miles of Reno began to encompass the city. When the regime had mobilized the Guard and reserves to assist in crushing the civil unrest, several batteries of the 148th Field Artillery Regiment had been rushed to deploy in Vegas. They'd been rushed to deploy to Vegas to back up all the support units of the Nevada National Guard, who for their part joined the Free American Army against the regime, with other units of the reserves in the area also, and several from Fort Huachuca down in Arizona that also defected and joined the Free American Army against the regime. In all the chaos, the 152nd Airlift Wing of the Air Force had stopped in Reno, where the 148th Field Artillery Brigade and all its howitzers and equipment, Field Artillery Regiment, and all its howitzers and equipment had been offloaded due to heavy combat around Nellis Air Force Base, making a safe landing impossible. Redeploying the 148th to Reno was the only option, as the regime was low on fuel and had to use it very, very sparingly. The 148th was one of only a handful of Guard units who actually stayed loyal to the rogue globalist regime. However, they were about to experience their first ever battle at Reno, which would determine the fate of all of northern Nevada. Meanwhile, other Arizona militias who answered the ham radio calls to action, already having planned for this day long ago with Todd, began to capture small communities in Arizona to rally support according to their overall common strategy. Thus had been born Todd Ellison's Uni0n of Southwestern Militias faction. Meanwhile, in the surrounding deserts and foothills around Reno, some 25,000 decently armed militias gathered for a showdown to seize the state capital. Facing them were some 3 battalions worth of artillery batteries. All in all, 9 of them, with their support and headquarters elements also in tow. For the time being, the 152nd Airlift of the Air Force was stuck at the airport due to fuel constraints, also using the time to do routine maintenance checks, unaware they were about to be assaulted. The militias gathered had some improvised weapons, such as, of course, the Molotovs, but also improvised mortars, not unlike the Mark 15 so-called barracks busters, so named by the British Army occupying Northern Ireland, as these IRA mortars did just that, destroyed barracks. The fuel situation being so horrible had caused the militias to plan accordingly and fill up fuel as groups, even when fuel rationing began. They rode in their technicals, some with homemade stovepipe mounts and gunner's shields for civilian legal RPKs with drum magazines, and even a few Barrett 50 cals. Also, some had the mortars. They all kept in touch by handheld radios and used each other as relays to pass messages down the line to other forces that were further away from each other, spaced out, to keep a solid chain of communications. It was 5 a.m. on the morning of the 2nd of July. When they quietly drove into the city, as the city was thus far quiet, not having had experienced the riots that some of the larger cities had and still were having. Local PD, still working for the time being, despite the currency collapse the day prior, stood down at the first sight of the huge train of technicals and SUVs, many now dropping off their fighters to seize choke points and set up for the battle they knew was coming. Todd planned to employ deep urban battle strategy of luring any would-be opponent into the city itself, only to be mauled by his elements as they set up everywhere, even now some on rooftops. The first regime convoy was spotted via rooftop observers. They steeled their nerves and set up ambushes citywide. Other fighters entered the Capitol building and took the state leaders prisoner. Further north, there was another faction who had been in contact via ham radio links with Todd Ellison and his forces in Nevada and Arizona. It was a similar force of rural mountain people organized in like militias who held strong conservative values, not Republicans, as the globalist orchestrated left-right paradigm lie illusion had fallen apart, with an entire land being disenfranchised by it, but a people who wanted to rid their region of Oregon and Washington states of all things woke, globalist, green, socialistic, and so on and so forth. They already had a name and were highly organized, even holding town meetings purview of regime loyalists to plan for this very future. Robert Allen was the leader of this force of some roughly 100,000 militiamen that over time would swell to about 400,000, like their allies just south of them in Nevada and Arizona. They too had stored away large logistical pools, but in the foothills and mountains of eastern Washington and Oregon. All their members had accumulated massive quantities of ammo, as well as cached away extra weapons as well. Little did Robert know, however, that soon he and a small element of his militias would be forced into an engagement, not on his terms either. 300 paramilitary so-called national security forces, which were former alphabet elements, were coming for him as he was a known militia leader, and the regime's NSA had previously been observing his huge following, being the regime was in turmoil, having just survived a deadly coup attempt and a general splintering of their forces. They needed to do anything within their increasingly curtailed abilities to nip any more resistance in the bud from anyone else. The regime's idle threats of firearms confiscations were utterly impossible, and they knew it. And even though the very few tightly controlled regime loyalist areas obeyed it, the rest of the land did not. As realistically, only the willing dupes and brainwashed of the regime zones would go and turn in theirs willingly, as the regime never had the manpower or logistical ability to even support such a momentous gargantuan task. But while the regime wanted crime and instability to give them a reason to make a few examples to scare the rest of the population into compliance, who all drastically outnumbered them, their arrogance and hubris did not allow them to see the dire realities of their own forces' woefully ill-prepared state of logistics, training, poor maintenance, and green, inexperienced new generation of troops. Also, demoralization in the ranks due to woke policies, and the utter breakdown in discipline, allowing for men to break ranks easily and join the junta, as their new Free American Army offered to take better care of them than the regime did itself, among other units leaving for other factions. Disarming America for the globalist regime was tantamount to trying to lift a house single-handedly. Quite impossible. However, their globalist anti-gun more, as peace within the land deteriorated permanently. The 300-man paramilitary goon squad, although coming in surprise, was about to bump into the vanguard of the Northwestern Conservative Army. 1,000 armed men encamped at and around Robert's compound, outside of the small town of Baker City, Oregon. This initial skirmish would begin the conflict in the coastal Pacific Northwestern states and lead to a seesaw-like life or death struggle between the regime and pro-regime militias and Robert Allen's Northwestern Conservative Army militias. Robert's family leather and saddle and ranch business had been destroyed by regime edicts in past years. So he thirsted for vengeance, and the opportunity rapidly approached as the National Security Forces goons came racing down Route 30 towards town from their base in Seattle, a city whose other elements of the same organization had just brutally put down the day prior, returning regime control to that city. But the mountains wasn't the city, as they were about to discover upon arrival. In New Mexico, much last week, even prior to the actual collapse, there had been prison riots in the penal facilities of southwestern states, which grew into a menace for the states, as did spillovers of the drug wars going on in neighboring Mexico. Part of the many reasons why Texas seceded and brutally suppressed the prison riots there. But no such luck in New Mexico. The intensity got so bad, prisoners used cleaning chemicals to make deadly gases, and murdered and took riot gear and non-lethal weapons from guards attempting to suppress said riots. Mexican drug gangs, meanwhile, initially began by moving across the border in New Mexico to flee Mexican security forces to hide out. But soon, they began to conduct raids across the border that grew into a full-scale invasion. There had been a truce among many of the cartels and their leaders. They all agreed that they needed a place where they could live in harmony and just melt like after the U.S. collapsed. They knew the system in the USA was teetering on the brink of oblivion and get their piece of the pie. Various drug lords began a campaign of assassinations and car bombs to strike at mostly the now waning and frail political leaders, mostly in New Mexico, but also in El Paso, Texas, as well as southern Arizona, until it got too dangerous, even for them, as the Uni0n of Southwestern militias already seized the Arizona border areas and established firm control there. Thus, it was settled and New Mexico had been chosen. They already had a firm foothold there insofar as distribution networks for their products and other agents and gang enforcers of theirs. So they gathered their forces and crossed via the New Mexico border before it was taken by the radical, fanatical, cultish kooks of the extremist Mormon State. But for the time being, it was still open. The New Mexico National Guard, under regime control, was caught off guard by the homemade armored vehicles and regular technicals of the cartel forces, complete with the rocket-propelled grenades and SA-7 air defense artillery man-portable shoulder-fired missiles, which could down helicopters and low-flying aircraft, and also fully automatic machine guns of several different caliber sizes as well. In Albuquerque, the gangs fighting the National Guard forces in the city welcomed their cartel brethren as reinforcements, having had taken Interstate 25 to get there, and relatively quickly. For the time being, El Paso had been vacated temporarily of the Fort Bliss forces who joined the state of Texas after it declared independence, although soon there'd be a large battle for control over El Paso, ending with an uneasy truce between Texas and the newly birthed Raza Narc0-State. And only because the encroaching radical Mormon State was far more of a peril in the eyes of Texas, amoral drug lords. Upon crushing the regime's last elements in the state of New Mexico, primarily the tiny New Mexican National Guard and some regime paramilitary national security forces elements, they emptied the prisons and enlisted all the formerly riotous inmates into their cause of assisting them in building a new free narco empire for the prosperity of all, of a confederation of cartels, gangs, and former prison inmates, and other types of criminals. Roughly some initial 200,000 armed criminal militant thugs crossed the border within the first 2 days of taking Albuquerque, and then Santa Fe as well, before the gangs executed the former state leaders, as well as liquidating via machine gun all the regime guard and paramilitary enemy prisoners of war. It was the Raza Narco-State's first atrocities. Soon there would be many, many more, as thugs began to terrorize the local population, as well as continue with assassinations and munitionings in far-off parts of the land, places they didn't have a reason to even attack, apart from trying to just aid and facilitate chaos in an attempt to keep other factions off of their backs. They avoided doing so to Texas, as Texas now had some working warplanes capable of ground attack missions, as well as drones and mechanized infantry, tanks, and artillery, much of which still worked for the time being, but it would become harder and harder to continue maintaining whole units at a combat effective level. And that's even considering the forces and facilities available to Texas, as well as them having still marginally better fuel production than most other factions arising everywhere would be able to have. The narco-state's main issue wouldn't be Texas upon concluding El Paso and concluding a truce over El Paso. La Raza would continue to use it as a transit corridor in peace with Texas. The real problem for La Raza was the encroaching extremist militant Mormon State, who expanded rapidly upon their church coup that overthrew Nelson and the governor all in one fell swoop. La Raza did still have its contacts in other parts of the land, though doing their narco business became increasingly deadly in certain zones where equally fanaticized, dangerous factions arose. La Raza got to work setting up their labs using any large structures they found available for industrial scale production of drugs, as had been done in Mexico. One side business of La Raza that they did get into was arms dealing, and they sold weapons imported from Latin America to the National Salvation Revolutionary Front. As in the very beginning, they had major battles with the Mormon State, and that's speaking of the NSRF, who itself hated with a religious fanatical zeal the Raza Narco-State and all it stood for and did, and that's speaking of the Mormon State hating La Raza. Supreme Acolyte Josiah and Grand Acolyte Mordecai put a holy war upon them and vowed to stamp them out once and for all. As the Mormon State and La Raza duked it out, the Mormon State expanded rapidly south and east into Colorado and part of New Mexico, and even some of Arizona, and north into part of Wyoming, when they met their biggest, strongest enemy in Wyoming, the secular humanist, ultra-nationalist, National Salvation Revolutionary Front, who vowed to build a new America in their own image and to stamp out all traces of the globalist regime, all its hallmarks, adherents, and followers via cleansing operations, as well as anyone who didn't put America first, albeit in a radical new meaning. The nation was a god unto itself, according to them. The Troika rulership of the humongous National Salvation Revolutionary Front created insignia, propaganda of every type, and even a slogan. We build a God out of blood from the ground up. It was a slogan that would mortify people across the land, as the roving death squads lived by that as a creed. Even the National Salvation Revolutionary Front death squads would grow into a fanatical elite paramilitary force in its own right, separate from the ordinary militias and some defected units in the National Salvation Revolutionary Front from the old armed forces of the USA. Their clashes with the equally psychotically fanatical Mormon State would seem apocalyptic to some degree, as huge artillery, rocket, and tank shell barrages, along with Mormon State suicide trucks of all sizes, and National Salvation Revolutionary Front barrel munitions and napalm barrel munitions scorched the landscape of the Wyoming battlefields. These initial confrontations, however, would also lead to another uneasy truce, but between these two, as over 200,000 died between both sides in just their initial encounter engagements, with neither side so much as budging. They each agreed to resolve it in one final apocalyptic future battle for the fate of America at a later time, as they each had other enemies to vanquish. As there were many emerging now, each with an agenda of their own. The Mormon State, the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, and the Free American Army all seized power or arose all at about the same time, right around the time that the junta launched their failed coup to return the USA back to its original constitutional rule, which will be described in its fullest details, along with the concurrent rise of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front and the Mormon State. July 1st was the date of General Mathis's failed coup attempt, an elaborate setup that involved some armed troops, mechanized infantry, special operations forces, and even naval Tomahawk cruise missiles. It was a coup that the regime barely was able to fend off. But as that was occurring in Utah, the church coup was occurring just hours before the 1st of July. On the night of the 30th, the governor had rushed to the temple to discuss with Nelson, a clergy response team member, the orderly takeover of Utah by the regime, using Nelson to broadcast an official church-wide announcement, along with the governor, to obey the globalist regime in all its ways, even if it seems wrong, in quotes. The globalist regime desperately needed their organized religion chills and state regimes to urge patience and cooperation, in quotes, with all regime orders. However, the nation was becoming anything but orderly. As the regime already was having a hard time in cities it even had normally a firm grip in, Nelson and the governor went over what they planned to announce in the next several hours. Meanwhile, militants of the Brigham Young Brigade were taking their places, preparing to seize TV and radio stations in Salt Lake City, and other affiliated Mormon State extremists prepared to seize control over their local areas of Utah as well, while yet others prepared to seize the military installations via a well-coordinated assault involving massive 18-wheeler suicide trucks packed with homemade explosives, ramming them through the gates and perimeter fencing. The Supreme Council of Elders told the drivers they would be with Joseph Smith and all the wives they'd ever want in heaven as their reward. The lunatics believed it too. On a separate note, international flights to Mexico brought in fringe Mormon extremists in their thousands to a trickle that would turn into a stream. They'd begin arriving in Utah and then all Mormon state-controlled territory, and then begin to establish militant training camps and compounds, and even terrorist bases of operations. One group under control of the Mormon State would even end up carrying out the biggest terrorist attack in all of human history, upon the Mormon State acquiring a nuclear weapon. The technicians, and with all the know-how and parts to make it go live. One faction would suffer dearly, as many lives would be incinerated in a fraction of a second. But that wouldn't come until the Mormon State seized the Air Force Base at Cheyenne, Wyoming, from the National Salvation Revolutionary Front in their initial apocalyptic clashes, who they ended up in a truce with anyway. No, rather, it would be another faction the Mormon State hated and loathed. As Nelson and the governor's meeting was well underway, amid the chaos in the rest of the land, Supreme Acolyte Josiah, clad in a plate carrier, along with Grand Acolyte Mordecai, burst through the temple doors, yelling and shooting their ARs and AKs, along with their select militants they brought along. began to get into a firefight with the governor's security detail inside. All inside the sanctuary. "You defiled the temple of God! You've disgraced the prophet Joseph Smith!" screamed Supreme Acolyte Josiah at the top of his lungs, amid the loud crackling of rifles and pistols popping. Blood was spilled as bullets smacked into heads, arms, legs, and into some of the chest plates of the armored vests worn by both militant and bodyguard alike. "Give up, Nelson! Give up!" yelled Josiah in a furious rage. All as he and 3 of his subordinate militants shot the last guard in the head, who hid behind a pew, trying to find a way to escape, as he knew all the others had been killed. Whap! Came the sound of rounds impacting the pew, passing through the wood into the man's skull. "Where are you, you bastard? You worm! You spawn of sin!" screamed Josiah, Supreme Acolyte of the Mormon State. "You 5, secure the sanctuary! You 10, come with us!" commanded Grand Acolyte Mordecai. The men proceeded in 2 columns, tactically through the halls, and checked the rooms, managing to shoot a few more guards on the way. By this point, it was all but over. The temple was surrounded by Mormon State militants of the Brigham Young Brigade. Other militants seized radio and TV stations and aired cassette tapes pre-recorded for the seizure of and radicalization of the entire Mormon Church. All by the Supreme Acolyte Josiah and his council of elders and their fringe radical sect of Mormonism. The recorded preachings went on and on about actual truths of what was occurring, but spun in with messages about it being the end times prophecies of Joseph Smith coming to pass, tied in with their own radical brand. The Utah Guard was told to stand down, join and obey the new way, the end-time Mormon State. The Guard, being mostly local and about 90% Mormon anyway, did obey. Others who were non-Mormons were told to convert to Mormonism or be beheaded. Josiah, finally having had found the governor and church president Nelson hiding in a closet, took them in order to have a show trial inside the temple, intending to eliminate both and any others who were of, pro, or part of the regime and considered unholy or unclean, in quotes. As for the regular active regime bases, such as Thule Army Depot and Proving Grounds, and also Hill Air Force Base, they were savagely overcome, according to the plan of the Supreme Council of Elders. Suicide trucks blasted whole areas where buildings once stood into craters, killing hundreds of people and maiming many more. Any who surrendered were given quarter only if they converted and swore an oath of allegiance to the Supreme Council of Elders. Shortly thereafter, Utah was all Mormon State territory, with its guard, reserves, and the local converts of the defeated regime forces formed into an element called Joseph Smith's own, in quotes, as the most capable elements of the Mormon State. Armed militant militias swelled, and the rights of women were removed, and they had the legal status as slaves. Many were sold in markets, and some had genital mutilations done to keep them pure and from becoming whores, according to the Supreme Council of Elders, as they called it. All clean and satanic, and thus was beheaded or thrown off of cliffs, or other macabre ways of dealing death to them. As civilization broke down, power had to be rationed, as coal took exceedingly long to transport by wagon trains drawn by horses, which was due to a lack of fuel in this region. As all fuel was sequestered for Mormon State military uses only, the Supreme Council of Elders and their reign of terror only began, and horrible atrocities followed them to all areas they conquered. Also, they continued to reach out and touch far-off factions by sending suicide vehicles and planting mines and other roadside munitions on commonly used roads, all done to lash out at all non-believers, wherever they were. So pronounced, prolific, and pervasive was the advent and spread of the Mormon State and its cultish psychopathy, hell-bent on destroying and disrupting all of the rest of America, using terror as a means to implement a theocratic regime over the entire land. The weakened globalist regime took note of its rise and sent 4 A-10 Warthog ground attack planes it had available to hit Mormon State compounds and militant training camps with Maverick missiles and Hellfire missiles, but all to little avail. And losing 3 planes in the process, Stinger shoulder-fired man-portable air defense systems as they pulled up from their attack runs. 1 pilot escaped and evaded capture, while 2 were caught and beheaded on video, which the video was snuck out of the nation and put onto Mormon State video accounts outside of the USA, where the regime had shut off apart from their state TV, which was their approved television stations. The Mormon State accounts were in other parts of the world. The state TV, however, was created by blending all the news agencies into one, controlled by the DC regime. Mormon State extremists retaliated by driving 2 truck munitions into Los Angeles and detonating them outside a National Security Forces paramilitary building. Supreme Acolyte Josiah ordered an intensified attack on the Gomorrahites of the regime stronghold of California State. What followed was a litany of roadside munitions that totally destabilized not only that region and caused immense infrastructure damage, but it was also such that the regime couldn't even afford to fix it. A commonality across the entire land, and an issue that all factions had to deal with in their own territories. Along with their attacks, the Mormon State had taken Pueblo, Colorado, along with its chemical weapons stockpiles in the depot there. Shells of very deadly VX as well as sarin nerve agents, able to be fired from the 155mm M198 howitzers of the 65th Field Artillery Brigade, formerly of the Utah Guard, now a proud part of Joseph Smith's own. The strongest forces of the Mormon State on the battlefield. As for the forces of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, they arose primarily in the central Midwest and seized control of the heartland of America and desired to cleanse the entire land of every last vestige of globalism and the globalist regime itself. The colonel, Alfred Motufu, and the third member of the Troika, Professor Albertson, sat together in the colonel's country home, in the basement bunker, a secret concrete reinforced command room of sorts. The men sat, the three, plotting their megalomaniacal schemes to rebirth a new America, taking America first, in quotes, to another level. America to them was everything. It was life. All in the land that felt the way they did about it belonged, regardless of, all in the land that felt the way that they felt about it belonged, regardless of race, color, or creed. However, those not willing to conform to the new ultra-nationalist program would be slaughtered, murdered, to build up a new America off of their blood and bodies. This war would decide the fate of America and of globalism. To the Troika, it was the ultimate final showdown, a live or die struggle, and the only option was to win at all costs, body counts be damned. It was a final showdown with globalist elitism, theocratic religions, and any others not willing to bow before their new almighty state. Their slogan was, "We build a God out of blood from the ground up." A pile of bodies was the foundation of the new America. All the old ways and paradigms had to be butchered in cold blood. The colonel had misgivings of certain members of the new regime's leadership council, of which the Troika reigned supreme unofficially at first, but now it was as certain as the rising sun is in the mornings. Henry Thompson isn't radical enough. We need cabinet heads that'll go all the way, even if it means liquidating unarmed civilians. We need unquestioning loyalty to our cause. Our new glorious state and the new nation built on the backs of the dead. We are going to murder as many as it takes, and everyone must be on board or they'll have to be put down like everyone else, stated the colonel matter-of-factly. Yes, I enjoy statistics. And these parasitic leeches and uber-rich deserve to become statistics the most, added Professor Albertson. Well, many have taken to the propaganda, all formats, especially the youth. They will make the best killers, just as was done in my parents' Congo. They'll be able to pull the triggers without hesitating. You know, in Africa, hacking limbs is pretty popular in civil wars there. I strongly suggest we implement this as soon as we can. Duly noted, Albert, said the colonel. He looked at his watch. As the operation was set to begin, it would begin with denial of service attacks on regime servers, along with coordinated militia assaults on their local communities' own power centers, to paralyze any sort of responses from any pro-regime security forces, as also rogue units of the Guard, Reserve, and even some few active forces, defecting units, began either seizing key infrastructure, state regime power centers, or committed acts of sabotage, along with coordinated assassinations and bombings of soft targets in order to create even more chaos apart from merely the riots already going on initially. Ham radio operators, all the while, staying in constant communications and contact to ensure the takeover runs smoothly, all of which went flawlessly causing the regime to lose control of vast swathes of territory of the nation, now becoming occupied by National Salvation Revolutionary Front forces. Many rogue commanders and also voluntary defectors from regime elements all played their parts flawlessly. And even when the shooting began, the National Salvation Revolutionary Front and its early amalgamation of various types of forces worked in concert and brutally crushed regime forces anywhere they tried to challenge them. The merciless wave of brutality and reprisals that came upon regime forces, regime loyalists, and snitches and Karens alike, as they're called, was swift. For 2 days after the ultra-right-wing, ultra-nationalists of the NSRF took over territory from Tennessee to Wyoming and from Michigan to Alabama, 50,000 were lined up and shot or hanged en masse with gallows that were repeatedly used. Or certain major enemy leaders were even tied to stakes and burned alive. As days went on, brutal death squads began to roam National Salvation Revolutionary Front territory, looking for enemies of the new faction that were in hiding, in order to hack them up with axes, machetes, chainsaws, or just to shoot them if the victims were fortunate enough. Of the 150-person leadership council, the initial 150-person leadership council, 40 were purged immediately for objecting to burning down of towns in recently captured areas, in what once may have been regime loyalist areas. Not being radical enough in the National Salvation Revolutionary Front was an instant death sentence, occasionally involving torture first, via hooking up car batteries to genitals or other body parts, for being weak and pathetic, sympathetic trash, as they said. No sympathy for the enemies of the new America was even allowed. Eventually, chemical weapons taken at Bluegrass, Kentucky, were to be used. They'd be put to use immediately once the National Salvation Revolutionary Front decided to use them against both the globalist regime forces and also the Free American Army forces in the Virginia campaign to try to break the stalemate there in battle. Initially, however, the National Salvation Revolutionary Front arose and seized first the north-central Midwest, beginning in primarily Nebraska, Iowa, and the Dakotas, via the use of rogue commanders within key guard and reserve forces, ultimately spreading rapidly like dominoes falling, as the mass confusion of the civil unrest, the failed coup of the Free American Army junta, and in general, all of the other factions arising all at nearly the same time, combined with the effective planning and coordination of Colonel McGregor and his Troika's plans, coupled with their propaganda of all forms, liaisoning with key leaders throughout the alt-right and armed forces components in the Midwest, all tossed into the combined chaos of the nation as a whole, allowed for such a resounding success. The DNS cyber attacks by hackers with alt-right or anarchist sympathies just prior to the regime cutting off the internet, and further chaos of random munitions detonating in many areas also, done by allies of the Troika, led to their ability to consolidate their power and iron grip over a vast chunk of territory, becoming the largest faction by military size as well as by population, only second to the regime. This due to the areas they encompassed being just nearly close in size to the regime areas, which were California, New York City, the metro area of New York, Philadelphia, New Jersey and Maryland, Delaware, Chicago, Detroit, and the Northwest Coast, among scattered small enclaves, small islands, as well of installations. Growing in a very slight lead in population, the National Salvation Revolutionary Front eventually did catch up with the regime and even surpassed them, the more territory they captured. Although the regime had far less resources available and less capable populations to draw forces from compared to the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, they were comparatively close in population. Besides that, the territory that the regime had was utterly broke. It had inflated currency and also couldn't afford to compete well against the other factions, who for their parts began to create their own forms of currency and/or economic systems, however primitive they were overall. Early on in the conflict, the National Salvation Revolutionary Front's Leadership Council, including its Troika of 3 supreme leaders, had plotted the seizure of the nation's missile silos. Nukes there also, and other weapons of mass destruction, partially succeeding, mostly in the domain of the VX and sarin shells, 155mm artillery stocks seized at Bluegrass, Kentucky Depot. But they did manage to overrun some silo locations in the north-central Midwest and laying siege to others, and their commanding installations as well, creating islands of regime forces control within the greater National Salvation Revolutionary Front territory. The NSRF did manage to seize some diesel-powered locomotives and rail hubs within its territory as well, though fuels of all types were extremely difficult to come by and extremely limited by what was basically in the train locomotives when seized and what little was left that remained in the rail yards that was accessible. Professor Albertson of the Troika micromanaged logistics as well as the prison system. He converted into murder centers former state and federal level penal facilities that became used as POW camps to imprison rival captured forces of the other factions, as well as extermination centers to torture and starve to death in cells to save food, and mass hang enemies of the Troika there as well. And their ultra-nationalist regime within the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, these facilities were operated by guards drawn from the elite paramilitary Jolly Roger Death Brigades, who originally were roving death squads in the first few weeks of the conflict, until they swelled their numbers to 200,000 of the most fanatical, brutal members of the entire National Salvation Revolutionary Front forces, who consisted of a core force of about 1 million former defected military forces and combat veterans of prior wars, and then a regular force of 3.8 million ultranationalist militias, and then the paramilitary death squads, the 200,000 elite fanatics of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, often who charged into overwhelming situations, often dealing heavy casualties, but taking them as well as also butchering the enemies of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front in the newly captured territories. They flew the flag of the Jolly Roger, the skull and crossbone flag, but it was a skull and crossed rifled flag. The the pursuit of weapons of mass destruction by both the National Salvation Revolutionary Front and the Mormon State led to one of the biggest, deadliest battles in the entire conflict at Cheyenne, Wyoming, and really all of southern Wyoming in general, leading to the uneasy truce due to neither really being able to defeat the other. All factions stemmed from not only civil unrest and collapse, but the failed coup added yet more dynamics by the junta of military commanders, who they themselves would even splinter off of the globalist regime as well, with many forces leaving with them, for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which being massive demoralization due to the woke policies, purges of the best personnel, poor treatment, poor leaders at the very top, and increasingly at all other levels, as the meritocracy was abolished, and many promotions were based on status and wokeness instead of good qualities. Some leaders pretended to accept it all, but deep down resentment grew, swelling to a torrent and ready to burst. Also, active forces and certain reserves, forced to participate in a certain experiment, aided issues too. The Free American Army and its junta leaders, their big coup attempt, and key battles will be explored in the next video of this documentary series called Battle Lines. The map battles as well, where real units, as well as relates to battles, preparedness for said battles, and aftermaths will all be covered. Beyond that, a third-part video for the documentary will cover more of the story deeper into the conflict, and more of the low-intensity aspects, as the second battle map video covers the higher intensity aspects, like the major battles, whereas lower intensity aspects are more like certain types of attacks and things like that, just here and there, or maybe occasional ambushes and any that are of note or of importance. And also what will be covered is the factions and how they develop their economic models and financial models, as well as other systems. And the fourth and final documentary series video will cover the ending stages of the war and corresponding developments right before the foreign Sino-Russian invasion occurs, which will, as mentioned, end the series and this documentary. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for paying attention, and thank you. I'm sorry for all the minor inconveniences with this, with the phone cutting out on me, but this was a